Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be tackling something pretty challenging. We're diving into the world of economics.
Like economics.
Yeah, but, and this is a big but, we're doing it with a mathematician's perspective, which should make things interesting, to say the least.
It's always refreshing to see a different perspective.
We're looking at a lecture by Claus Peter Ortlieb, and let me tell you, he doesn't hold back in his critique of neoclassical economics.
That's right. And what makes Ortlieb so interesting is that he's not an economist by training. He's a mathematician. And not just any mathematician, he specializes in mathematical modeling.
Yeah.
We're talking about the kind of hardcore math that underpins physics, engineering, you name it.
So this isn't some armchair economist spouting off opinions. This is a guy who really understands the power and, maybe more importantly, the potential pitfalls of using math to represent really complex systems.
Absolutely. And that's what makes his critique of neoclassical economics so insightful. He's coming at it from this very rigorous mathematical perspective and saying, hold on a second, some of these fundamental assumptions, these things you're taking for granted, well, they might look good on paper, but they don't always hold up in the real world.
Kind of like assuming a map is the actual terrain.
Yeah,
You might miss a chasm or two if you're not careful, right?
exactly.
So where does Ortlieb start poking holes in these assumptions? Give us some examples, something that really sets them apart.
Well, one of his key arguments is about the overuse and sometimes misuse of the ceteris paribus assumption in a lot of economic models.
Oh, ceteris paribus.
Yeah.
Right. All other things being equal. I remember that from my econ classes. It always felt like a bit of a cop-out, to be honest.
Right, and Ortlieb would probably agree with you there. See, it's one thing to use ceteris paribus in a controlled experiment where you can actually hold everything else constant, right? But in something as messy and unpredictable as a real-world economy, well, it's not so simple.
It almost feels like you're ignoring the chaos of reality to fit your neat little theory.
Yeah, and to illustrate this point, Ortlieb uses a really interesting example, the labor market. He challenges this classic neoclassical argument that unemployment is essentially just a matter of wages being too high.
Okay, so the idea is if you just let wages fall to a certain point, the market will find its magical equilibrium,
Yeah.
and everyone who wants a job will get one.
Exactly. Classic supply and demand, but with workers instead of widgets or whatever. But, and this is Ortlieb's point, it ignores a whole bunch of other factors that are crucial in the real world.
Like what?
Well, for one, he argues that even if wages go down, if people aren't out there buying stuff, businesses still won't hire more people. There's no demand to meet.
It's like thinking you'll solve traffic by making cars more affordable. More people might be able to buy them, but they'll still be stuck in traffic.
Precisely, you've got to look at the bigger picture.
So it sounds like Ortlieb is saying that traditional economics often simplifies human behavior, tries to squeeze it into these neat little equations without acknowledging the messiness of how people actually make decisions.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another one of his criticisms, this idea of the backward bending labor supply curve.
Okay, backward bending. Now you're just messing with me.
Right.
I'm going to need you to break that one down for me.
Okay, so imagine a graph, right? And on one axis you have wages, and on the other you have the number of hours people work. Now, traditional economics would say that as wages go up, people will always want to work more hours. So you'd have this nice upward sloping line on your graph.
Makes sense. Work more, earn more.
Right. But Ortlieb says it's not always that simple. He argues that past a certain point, people might actually choose to work fewer hours, even if it means earning a bit less.
Wait, really? Why would anyone do that?
Well, think about it. Once you reach a certain level of income, you might start to value your free time more, right? You might want to spend more time with family, pursue hobbies, or just relax.
Okay, so it's not always about maximizing income. It's about maximizing well-being, which includes things like leisure time, personal fulfillment, all that good stuff.
And that's a crucial point that Ortlieb is making.
I'm starting to see why he's considered a radical thinker in this field.
He's asking us to consider those very human elements that traditional economics often overlooks. He argues that neoclassical economics can become almost like an ideology. It's like a set of beliefs that, while maybe mathematically elegant on paper, don't always reflect the nuances and complexities of how things actually play out in the real world.
It's like that old saying, the map is not the territory. You can have a beautiful, detailed map, but if it doesn't match the actual terrain, it's not going to do you much good.
Exactly. And speaking of maps and territories, one of the areas where Ortlieb really digs deep is in his critique of subjective value.
Ah, subjective value. Okay, so we're getting into some pretty fundamental questions here about how we assign value to things in the first place. Remind us, what's the neoclassical take on this?
So, neoclassical economics basically says that the value of something is determined by how much people are willing to pay for it. It's all about individual preferences, right? If you're thirsty in the desert, a bottle of water is going to be worth a lot more to you than, say, a gold coin.
Right, makes sense. So what's Ortlieb's problem with that? It seems pretty straightforward.
Well, he argues that this idea of subjective value, while it might explain individual choices in certain situations, it doesn't really give you a solid foundation for building a whole economic theory. It's like trying to build a house on sand, it's just not that stable.
Okay, I see where he's going with this.
Mm.
So how does he unpack that idea? What's the problem with subjective value from his perspective?
One of the things he points out is if value is completely subjective, if it's all relative, then how can you really have a truly objective economic theory? I mean, how do you measure? How do you compare?
Yeah, it seems like everything becomes relative, so it's hard to make any definitive statements.
Exactly. And Ortlieb argues that this whole emphasis on subjective value can actually obscure the real power dynamics that are at play in an economy, the things that actually influence prices and value.
Like what kind of power dynamics? Give me an example.
Well, think about luxury goods, right? Those designer handbags, high-end sneakers, things like that.
Okay, so those are a good example of where subjective value gets really interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because often the price of those items has very little to do with their actual material cost or even the labor that went into making them. It's all about the brand name, the scarcity, that kind of thing.
Right, and that's exactly what Ortlieb is talking about. He argues that the prices of those goods are often driven more by marketing hype, by speculation, by perceived status, rather than any kind of inherent value in the object itself.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, one man's trash is another man's treasure. But when you apply that to economics, it gets a lot more complicated.
And potentially a lot less fair, which is Ortlieb's point. He's suggesting that this emphasis on subjective value, rather than acknowledging these other forces that are at play, can actually contribute to things like inequality and market manipulation.
Okay, so walk me through that. How does this idea of subjective value potentially lead to more inequality?
Well, think about it this way. If you focus solely on individual preferences and what people are willing to pay, you might overlook some of the systemic issues that actually prevent people from participating fully in the market in the first place.
Things like poverty, discrimination, lack of access to education, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And Ortlieb argues that neoclassical economics, with its emphasis on individual choice and market forces, can sometimes downplay or even ignore those very real, very significant factors.
So it's kind of like saying, well, if you're poor, it's because you're not making the right choices in the market without acknowledging that the playing field might not be level to begin with.
That's a great way to put it. And Ortlieb is pushing back against that. He's saying we need to look at the bigger picture, consider those systemic factors, those power imbalances, if we want to understand how value is truly created and distributed in a society.
It's almost like he's saying that focusing too much on subjective value without that broader context can lead to policies that place the blame on individuals for their economic circumstances rather than addressing some of those underlying structural issues.
Exactly. And that's where his perspective as a mathematician, someone who's trained to look for patterns, to look for those underlying structures, that's where that becomes so valuable.
He's connecting the dots between individual choices and those larger systemic realities.
Absolutely. Ortlieb is pushing us to acknowledge those connections and to grapple with the ethical implications of a purely subjective view of value. He's saying that economics isn't just about numbers and equations, it's about people's lives, it's about their relationships to each other and to the systems they inhabit.
It's a much more humane approach to economics in a way.
It is.
So if Ortlieb is critiquing these foundational assumptions of neoclassical economics, does he offer any kind of alternative model, any solutions? What's his prescription here?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that a lot of economists and critics have grappled with. It's tough because Ortlieb isn't necessarily saying, here's the new economic model to end all models, this is the answer. He's more focused on shaking things up, on making us question what we think we know about economics.
So instead of giving us a new blueprint, he's handing us a toolbox and saying, go figure it out yourselves.
In a way, yes. He's urging us to be more critical, more aware of the limitations of these models, the assumptions built into them, and most importantly, he's asking us to consider the ethical implications of our economic thinking.
Ethical implications, interesting. Because we often think about economics as this objective science,
Yeah.
right? Numbers, graphs, equations, it all seems very cut and dry.
Right, and Ortlieb would say, not so fast. He's pointing out that economics is never truly neutral. It's always intertwined with politics, with social structures, with power dynamics, whether we acknowledge it or not. He's warning us against mistaking mathematical elegance for real-world accuracy or even moral neutrality.
So it's about recognizing the biases that might be baked into the very foundation of our economic thinking.
Exactly. And those biases, those unexamined assumptions, they can have very real consequences.
Can you give me an example? How do these biases actually play out in the real world?
Well, think about how we measure economic progress, for example. We often focus on things that are easily quantifiable, right? GDP growth, stock market performance, those kinds of metrics.
Yeah, the things you can put a number on.
Right. But Ortlieb would argue that by focusing solely on those metrics, we might be missing other important indicators of well-being, things like environmental health, social equality, even just general happiness and well-being. These things are much harder to measure, but they're just as important, if not more so, than the numbers on a spreadsheet.
It's like that old saying, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted.
Exactly. Ortlieb is urging us to look beyond the numbers, to grapple with the full complexity of human experience, and to acknowledge that economic systems should serve people, not the other way around.
It's a call for a more holistic perspective on economics, one that acknowledges the limits of traditional thinking and seeks out new ways of understanding and measuring what truly matters. That's a challenge, but an incredibly important one.
I agree, and it's a challenge that Ortlieb believes is crucial if we want to create a more just and equitable world. He's asking us to step outside the comfort zone of those neat, elegant neoclassical models and really engage with the messiness, the complexity of the real world.
It's about recognizing that people aren't just rational actors in a market. They're individuals with hopes, dreams, fears, vulnerabilities, all of which are shaped, in part, by the economic systems we create.
Well said. And that's what makes Ortlieb's critique so compelling, even if it's a little bit unnerving at times. He's not just critiquing models, he's challenging us to rethink our values, our priorities, our very understanding of what it means to live in a just and equitable society.
It's a call to action, to engage with economics not just as this abstract set of theories and equations, but as a field that directly shapes the fabric of our lives. It's something we all have a stake in. Well, I think it's safe to say this deep dive has given us a lot to chew on, a lot to think about, maybe even some homework to do. So whether you're an economics enthusiast or just someone trying to make sense of the world around you, Ortlieb's insights offer a powerful reminder to question assumptions, to challenge conventional wisdom, to never stop seeking a deeper understanding. Thanks for joining us today on The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time for another adventure into the depths of knowledge.